Political freedom, public institutions, and economic growth, a global analysis since the fall of the Soviet Union. First off, why should we care about the effects of political freedom on economic growth? Well, policymakers around the world seek to promote democracy, citing economic growth as a benefit of democratization. More importantly, the global economy is only becoming more and more interdependent every day. This can be demonstrated from the 2008 financial crisis, which not only affected markets here, but affected markets in Europe and Asia. It can be demonstrated more recently by the European debt crisis, which is affecting markets in Europe and Asia as well as markets here. This just illustrates further that everybody's economy is intertwined in today's global economy. Previous research on political freedom and economic growth is vast, and a lot of it has been done for many, many years. It's been conducted by economists and social scientists alike, but they both come to contradictory results on whether or not political freedom has positive effects on economic growth. While reading through the literature pertaining to political freedom and economic growth, there's three main themes that emerge. The first being that political freedom has a positive effect on economic growth. The scholars who argue this, they cite the fact that politically free countries allow citizens to replace politicians who have adopted damaging policies. Additionally, the scholars argue that politically free countries protect individual property rights more generally than non-politically free countries. And also, scholars argue that politically free countries tend to have a greater emphasis on transparency, education, control of corruption, and foreign trade. There are some scholars that point out while they do acknowledge that politically free countries political freedom does promote economic growth, they do caution about the results of growth, saying that it may be due to the length and location of the regime, not the regime type itself. The third thing that popped out in the literature pertaining to political freedom and economic growth was that political freedom actually has a negative effect on economic growth. The scholars who argue this cite the fact that politically free countries, there is often a high demand for welfare spending, and political pressure often prevents politicians from adopting the necessary economic policies. Also, scholars point to the fact that politically free countries tend to have higher inflation, faster wage growth, and larger fiscal deficits than non-politically free countries. And the last thing that stood out in the literature pertaining to political freedom and economic growth was that political freedom does not have an effect on economic growth. It's some other factor or variable that is driving economic growth. While those factors are vast, I'm going to be focusing on three for this presentation. Economic volatility, the presence of quality public institutions, and the level of human capital and knowledge within the country. Upon the research pertaining to economic volatility and economic growth, three themes emerged in this literature as well. The first being that some scholars argue that the lack of economic volatility actually determines the economic growth rate, citing the confidence levels that low levels of volatility bring to the private sector and the financial sector, attracting both domestic and foreign investment. Other scholars argue that volatility has no effect on economic growth whatsoever, positive or negative. This is due to the interdependence and globalization of today's economy. And there are some scholars that actually argue that economic volatility leads to economic growth, especially in politically free developed countries with large export-based economies. In the previous research that pertains to quality institution, there was one overarching theme that was present, and that was institutions do indeed matter. And what I mean by public institutions, I mean legislative branches, regulatory agencies, consumer protection agencies, public institutions that make reforms and regulations and set the rules for economic growth. Within the literature, scholars point to the fact that economic growth rates increase with improvements in quality institutions, citing the political stability and bureaucratic efficiency that comes from improvements in institutions. They also point out to the fact that lower developed countries may not grow as fast or at all if they suffer from weak institutions. And again, one of the main things that was prevalent in the literature pertaining to quality institutions and economic growth was that institutions do indeed matter. And with economic growth rates continually increase with improvements in public institutions. The last driving force here, other variable besides regime type that I've been discussing is knowledge or human capital. Since the global expansion of the internet and now smartphones, scholars have started to argue more and more that economies will be driven by new knowledge-based enterprises rather than traditional production and natural resource economies. This has made many scholars point to the fact that the level of human capital that a country has is going to be, or is, the number one determining factor of economic growth capabilities. Scholars do point out that human capital is often limited to developmental status, as well as regional and sometimes cultural barriers. The theoretical framework that my research is housed in is called New Growth Theory. New Growth theorists stress the need for government institutions which nurture innovation and provide incentives to individuals to be inventive. Institutions give confidence to the private sector and by ensuring proper regulations are in place for economic growth to be sustained. And New Growth Theory helps us understand the continuous shift from a resource-based economy to a knowledge-based economy. While New Growth Theory focuses on the presence of quality institutions and the level of human capital within a country, does not emphasize the volatility or stability of economic markets, which is where I hope to fill and avoid in this theory. I have four hypotheses for my research. The first is that political freedom promotes economic growth. The second is the lack of economic volatility promotes economic growth. The third being the presence of quality public institutions, which is needed to promote economic growth. And four, lastly, the level of knowledge a country has promotes economic growth. I constructed an original database from several secondary data sources. I used the International Monetary Fund as my database for economic growth rates. They define economic growth as a gross domestic product within a nation in a given year. Also, I derive my economic volatility from the economic growth rates, and it is measured from taking the standard deviation of GDP between years measured, higher standard deviation, higher volatility. And economic volatility is defined as excessive changes in financial markets and high inflation. I use Freedom House's Freedom Index comparative data ranging from 1990 to 2009. Freedom House gives political freedom an operational definition of ensuring political rights and civil liberties. And the purpose of this model, free countries are labeled as 3, partly are labeled as 2, and non-free are labeled as 1. And here's a map of non-free, partly free, and free countries for 2009. And I use the Heritage Foundation's Economic Freedom Index from 1990 to 2009 that measures freedom from corruption, among other freedoms, as a proxy variable for the quality of institutions. This has been the precedent in literature from several scholars, including Dr. Grammy from the economics department. And for the purpose of this model, 100 is corruption-free and 0 is totally corrupt. I use the United Nations for my female higher education rates. And they define higher education as education designed to continue basic programs of the primary level. While I only chose to include female higher education in here because I wanted to get a more accurate description of the educational opportunities that are available within a country, because a lot of lower developed countries and some for other cultural reasons deny women access to the right to education, so I wanted to get a true measure of the educational opportunities, so I only included women. I also control for several other sources of economic growth within my time series. I control for the country's population, so control for the central bank, and I control for natural resources, specifically petroleum, coal, and natural gas. Now the results. Results of the fixed effects pooled cross-sectional time series, not cool, as you can see, show that hypothesis 1 and 3, political freedom is needed to promote economic growth and quality institutions is needed to promote economic growth are true due to both coming at the below the 0.05 level and having the correct relationship of coefficients. While volatility, economic volatility, also came in as statistically significant, it had a positive relationship. And I hypothesized that it would have a negative relationship. So as economic volatility would rise, economic growth would fall, but obviously the results of the full cross-sectional time series actually show that it actually increased growth a little bit. And as far as the control variables and, female education. Female education also is statistically significant, but with a negative relationship. So with the increase in female education, economic growth actually goes down. Now, I believe that the case for this is one of the, just recently said, is because I only included women in the higher education variable. I believe if I include, find a different measure, the results are different. Other control variables, all were statistically significant except for natural gas, and population and central bank had negative relationships, which I found that interesting with the central bank having a negative relationship. I guess positive that because they look for long-term growth rather than short-term growth. Again, the natural resources, except natural gas, coal and petroleum, which reinforces what we've known before. So the findings of my study reaffirm that spreading political freedom throughout the globe should be a priority for economic growth, besides other reasons. Also, the findings coincide with one of the themes of New Growth Theory, the need for government institutions. It didn't coincide with the need for education, but they explained about the results. And the results show that economic volatility is not harmful for economic growth, bolstering the arguments made by some scholars that we're in such an interdependent economy that volatility should not be considered. Again, other control variables in my analysis, coal, petroleum exports are statistically significant, and only natural gas exports failed to produce statistically significant. And the presence of this central bank, which is still a little bit puzzling to me, but produce a negative relationship. Future research, I would like to examine the regime types effects on quality institutions, as well as examine the efficiency of such institutions. And I want to take a further look at what's going on with the central bank. Maybe it's the independence of the central bank that is affecting the economic growth. Maybe it's something that I wanted to investigate the central bank further. And finally, I want to examine if the model holds true across all regions and eventually develop a predictive model. I'd like to thank the McNair Scholars Program. I'd like to thank the Department of Political Science, Dr. Michael Alt, my faculty advisor, Dr. Vito Kamori, Dr. Arlis Grandy, Professor Kent Price, faculty advisors, Dr. Isabel Samaya, and Victoria Champion Choi.